December 16, 1944. The Schnee-Eifel Ardennes forest. The air is a physical weight, thick with freezing fog and the smell of wet pine. Beneath the canopy of the dense woods, the veteran grenadiers of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division move like ghosts. They are confident. They have practiced the art of the silent approach, moving under the cover of a massive opening barrage that has just ceased. To the German commanders, the math is simple. It takes time for an enemy to recover, time to relay coordinates, and time to walk shells onto a moving target. They expect a delay. They expect a clumsy, methodical response of an army tied to rigid telegraph lines and slow calculations. Instead, the silence of the forest is not broken by a single ranging shot, but by a sudden, simultaneous roar that feels like the sky has been torn in half. There is no whistling warning, no bracketing of the position. In one heartbeat, dozens of 105mm shells, fired from different batteries at different distances, converge on this exact patch of earth at the exact same microsecond. The earth thrashes upward in a geyser of shrapnel and frozen mud. This is not luck. This is a time-on-target mission, a terrifying display of American industrial math that would rewrite the rules of the battlefield. To understand why the German infantry was so utterly paralyzed by the speed of American fire, one must look back to the scars of the Great War. In 1918, artillery was a blunt instrument. It was a weapon of mass, not precision. Batteries were often static, tethered to rigid firing plans that were drawn up days in advance. If an infantry officer on the front line saw a new threat, he had to navigate a labyrinth of telephone wires and bureaucratic hierarchies to request support. By the time the shells arrived, the target was often gone, or worse. The situation had shifted so drastically that the friendly troops were now in the impact zone. The United States Army, emerging from the First World War, realized that the next conflict would be defined by fluid movement. They recognized a fundamental truth. A gun that fires 100 rounds too late is less valuable than a gun that fires 10 rounds at the perfect moment. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, while the world's eyes were on the flashy developments of tanks and aircraft, the U.S. Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, was quietly conducting a revolution. They weren't just looking for better explosives. They were looking for a better system of communication and mathematics. The Americans moved away from the concept of individual batteries acting as independent units. Instead, they pioneered the Fire Direction Center, FDC. This was the central nervous system of the artillery. In the traditional European model, the observer on the hill did the math, calculated the angles, and told the guns where to point. In the new American model, the observer simply acted as the eyes. He sent back raw data, the where and what, and the FDC, a small group of specialized technicians located safely behind the lines, performed the complex ballistic geometry. This shift was monumental. It meant that any forward observer could talk to any battery in range. It meant that fire could be massed from multiple different locations onto a single point without the batteries ever seeing each other. The Americans were building a switchboard for death, an industrial-scale clearinghouse for coordinates that treated high-explosive shells like data points in a ledger. By the time the United States entered the war in late 1941, they possessed a doctrine of flexibility that no other nation, not even the technically proficient Germans, had managed to replicate. The hardware that supported this doctrine was the M101 105mm howitzer. It wasn't the largest gun on the battlefield, nor was it the longest ranged, but it was incredibly reliable, easy to transport, and possessed a high rate of fire. Most importantly, it was backed by a logistics chain that ensured American gunners almost never had to worry about shell hunger. While German batteries were often rationed to a handful of rounds per day due to strained supply lines, the American philosophy was to let the shells do the work. They would rather spend $10,000 on steel than a single American life. As the U.S. forces landed in North Africa and later moved through Sicily and Italy, this system was refined under the pressure of real-world combat. The Americans learned to integrate radios, specifically the FM sets that were far superior to the AM radios used by the Axis, into every level of the command structure. This allowed for a terrifyingly short sensor-to-shooter loop. In some cases, an American unit could call for fire and have rounds landing on the target in under 3 minutes. To a German officer accustomed to the 10 to 20-minute response times of his own artillery, this felt less like warfare and more like an act of God. By the time the Allied armies surged across the hedgerows of Normandy and into the open plains of northern France in 1944, the disparity between German and American artillery philosophy had reached a breaking point. The German here was by no means lacking in quality. Their 88mm multipurpose guns were legendary, and their heavy Nebelwerfer rocket launchers could blanket an area in terrifying fire. However, the German system was decentralized and often hampered by a rigid, top-down command structure. German artillery was frequently organic to specific divisions, meaning it was difficult for a commander in one sector to borrow the fire of a battery in another without a slow, arduous trek to the chain of command. Furthermore, the German army was increasingly demodernizing. While propaganda showed panzer divisions and half-tracks, the vast majority of the German infantry relied on horse-drawn logistics. Moving heavy artillery pieces was slow, and their communication relied heavily on physical telephone wires. In the chaotic, fast-moving battles of 1944, these wires were constantly severed by American shells or tank treads, leaving German batteries blind and unable to react to the shifting front. The Americans, by contrast, had fully embraced the concept of the fire mission. In the U.S. Army, artillery was treated as a communal pool of power. Through the use of the Fire Direction Center, a single forward observer, even a lowly lieutenant, could potentially command the fire of an entire corps' worth of guns if the situation warranted it. This was made possible by the graphic firing table, a specialized slide rule that allowed FDC technicians to instantly translate map coordinates into elevation and deflection data for the gun crews. This mathematical speed was bolstered by the sheer abundance of American equipment. By late 1944, the U.S. was producing shells at a rate that staggered German intelligence. During the Battle of the Bulge, American batteries would sometimes fire more rounds in a single afternoon than a German battery would receive in a month. This allowed the Americans to pioneer the concept of pre-registered fire. Before an attack even began, American observers would pick out every logical place a German might hide, a crossroads, a stone farmhouse, a dense thicket, and calculate the firing data for those spots in advance. When the German infantry finally stepped out from their cover to launch a counterattack, they weren't walking into a dynamic battle. They were walking into a pre-calculated death zone. The American gunners weren't aiming in the traditional sense. They were simply executing a mathematical program. This industrialized slaughter changed the psychology of the German soldier. They began to feel that no matter how well they hid or how fast they moved, the steel rain was already waiting for them. The speed of the American response was so high that many German prisoners of war were convinced the Americans had developed a secret radar that could see through trees and fog. In reality, it was just better radios, better math, and refusal to let the guns stay silent. As the winter of 1944 descended, this system would be put to its ultimate test. The Germans were preparing their final great gamble in the West, an offensive that relied on speed and the neutralization of Allied air power. They believed that without their planes, the Americans would be helpless. They had forgotten about the guns, the tactical angle, the FDC brain. The true secret of American speed lay not in the barrels of the guns, but in the tents and trailers of the Fire Direction Center, FDC. This was a revolutionary middleman between the observer and the gunner in other armies. If an observer wanted to hit a target, he had to tell the gunners exactly how to adjust their pieces, a slow, error-prone process. In the American system, the observer simply shouted coordinates and the type of target into a radio. Inside the FDC, a team of horizontal and vertical control operators used plotting boards and the graphic firing table to translate those coordinates into firing data. They accounted for wind speed, air density, and even the temperature of the gunpowder. Within dozens of seconds, the math was complete and relayed to the batteries. This centralization allowed the Americans to perform the time-on-target, TOT maneuver, where guns of different calibers, located miles apart, fired at staggered intervals so that every shell arrived at the target at the exact same second. The technological angle, the radio revolution, while the German army still relied heavily on field telephones and runners, vulnerable to the slightest disruption, the U.S. Army was the first truly wireless force. The SCR-300 walkie-talkie and the vehicle-mounted SCR-608 gave the Americans an unbreakable advantage. Mobility. A forward observer, FO, could crawl into a hayloft, see a German platoon assembling 3,000 yards away, and speak directly to the guns while moving. The American FM frequency modulation. Radios were crystal clear compared to the static-heavy AM sets used by the Germans. This meant that even in the middle of a screaming blizzard or a chaotic firefight, the request for fire was heard and understood the first time. The radio turned every American lieutenant into a man who could summon the power of 100 cannons with a single sentence. The human angle. The forward observer, FO. The most dangerous job in a European theater was not being a tank commander or a paratrooper. It was being a forward observer. The FO was a high-value target, often operating hundreds of yards ahead of the friendly infantry line. Armed only with a map, a compass, and a radio, they were the eyes of the artillery. German snipers were specifically trained to look for the men with binoculars and radio antennae. If an FO was killed, the god of war went blind. Yet, these men developed a bond with the gunners miles behind them. They spoke a shorthand language of fire missions and splashes. To the infantrymen huddled in foxholes, the FO was a guardian angel. If a German Tiger tank appeared, the FO didn't run. He whispered into his handset, adjusted his glasses, and waited for the world to explode in front of him. The leadership angle. Decentralized lethality, one of the most profound differences between the two armies, was the level of authority granted to junior officers. In the German Wehrmacht, calling for heavy artillery support often required the approval of divisional or even corps-level commander, especially as ammunition became scarce toward the end of the war. In contrast, the U.S. Army practiced a form of decentralized lethality. A single American forward observer, often a second lieutenant, had the authority to call for fire from every gun in his sector without asking for permission from a superior officer. This trust in the lowest level of leadership meant that American fire was not just fast, it was proactive. If a lieutenant saw a threat, he dealt with it instantly. This bottom-up approach to firepower terrified German officers, who could not understand how the Americans were able to make such high-level tactical decisions with such speed and autonomy. The enemy angle. The psychological shelling for the German infantrymen. The American artillery was more than a physical threat. It was a psychological trauma. German veterans of the Eastern Front, who had survived the massive, predictable Barrages of the Soviet Red Army, found the American style of fire deeply unsettling. Soviet fire was massive but often imprecise, a blunt hammer that gave soldiers time to hunker down. American fire, however, was described as sniping with howitzers. The speed at which American gunners could adjust fire, moving the impact zone by 50 or 100 yards based on a single radio correction, meant that nowhere was safe. The German term for this was Führerzauber or fire magic. Prisoners often recounted how they felt personally hunted by the shells, as if an invisible eye was watching their every move and reacting in real time. This led to a rapid degradation of morale. When the steel rain began, German troops often felt that the battle was already lost, regardless of their own skill or bravery. The moral and industrial angle. The logistics of mercy. From a strategic perspective, the American reliance on rapid, massive artillery fire was a moral choice masked as a military one. The U.S. High Command was acutely aware that the American public had a low tolerance for high casualty rates. To mitigate the meat grinder nature of infantry combat, they utilized their industrial superiority to substitute steel for blood. This logistics of mercy meant that the U.S. would rather fire 500 shells to take a single ridge than send a company of men into a frontal assault. This created a lopsided industrial war. The American factory worker in Detroit or Pittsburgh was effectively fighting on the front lines, providing the bottomless crates of ammunition that allowed the gunners to adjust fire without hesitation. For the Germans, who were forced to conserve every round, this was a war they simply could not win. The American ability to adjust fire fast was the ultimate expression of a superpower's industrial will. The ultimate demonstration of this lethal efficiency occurred during the frozen nightmare of December 1944, the Battle of Elsenborn Ridge. While the world remembers a heroic stand at Bastogne, it was at Elsenborn that the German 6th Panzer Army, the strongest force Hitler had ever assembled for the Ardennes offensive, hit an immovable wall of American fire. The Germans had planned for a lightning strike, a west wall breakthrough that would reach the Meuse River in days. Their elite SS Panzer divisions were equipped with the formidable King Tiger tanks and some of the best-trained infantry remaining in the Third Reich. But they had not accounted for the V Corps artillery and the speed of the American steel ring. As the German offensive kicked off in the pre-dawn darkness, they initially found success under the cover of a massive 1,600-gun opening barrage. But as the fog lifted and the German infantry began their primary assault against the American 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, the American system roared to life. This was not the panicked, scattered response the Germans expected. Despite the chaos of surprise attack, American forward observers had already established pre-planned fires on every draw, ravine, and road leading to the ridge. The Germans attempted a classic maneuver, pinning the Americans with machine gun fire while their heavy tanks bypassed the strong points. In previous years, this would have worked. But now, the American FDCs were working at a fever pitch, using the newly perfected SER 608 radios. Observers on the heights of the ridge called in coordinates for target number 12 or target number 15. They weren't describing the enemy. They were calling out a pre-calculated index of death. Within 90 seconds of the call, the first ranging rounds would land. To the German grenadiers, it was a terrifyingly personal experience. They would hear the distant thump of the guns, and before they could even dive for cover, the shells were among them. The American gunners weren't just firing at the front lines. They were using their superior range and speed to box in the German units, firing behind them to cut off retreat, and then walking the fire directly into the center of the formation. The speed of the adjustment was so rapid that German commanders reported their units being wiped out before they could even deploy from their marching columns. The true turning point within the battle occurred when the Americans unleashed their most terrifying mathematical weapon, the time-on-target TOT mission. On the afternoon of December 17th, as the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend attempted a massive armored push toward the twin villages of Krinkel-Tracherath, the V Corps artillery commander realized that conventional battery by battery fire would not stop the momentum of the heavy tanks. He ordered a corps-wide TOT. This required a level of coordination that no other army on Earth could achieve in the heat of battle. The fire direction centers calculated the exact flight time for shells from over 150 guns, ranging from 105mm howitzers to massive 8-inch Black Panther cannons. Because the batteries were located at different distances from the target, some guns fired several seconds before others. The goal was for every single shell to reach the German assembly area at the exact same moment. The result was a literal wall of fire that seemed to fall out of the clear sky. There was no warning. There was no gradual buildup. One moment, the German panzers were idling in the tree line, preparing their final lunge. The next, the entire force exploded in a synchronized hurricane of steel and high explosives. The concussion was so great it shattered the eardrums of men in nearby bunkers. The sheer volume of fire didn't just destroy the tanks. It turned the frozen ground into a churned mire, making it impossible for surviving vehicles to maneuver. The German infantry, who had been taught that the Americans were soft and reliant on air support, watched in horror as their elite armor was shredded by a force they couldn't see. The adjust fire commands coming from the observers on a ridge were so precise that they were able to drop shells within 50 yards of their own foxholes to scrape off German borders. By the time the sun set on Elsenborn, the 6th Panzer Army's spearhead was broken. They had expected a fight against men. They found themselves fighting an industrial machine that could calculate their death in seconds. This moment changed the trajectory of the Ardennes offensive. Not because of a single heroic charge, but because the American God of War was faster than the German blitzkrieg. The silence that followed the great barges at Elsenborn Ridge and the surrounding Ardennes sectors was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, ringing silence of a shattered army. As the German offensive sputtered into a defensive retreat, the true cost of the steel rain became visible. Surveying the battlefields, American officers found scenes that defied traditional military logic. They discovered entire German platoons frozen in time, men still in their foxholes or crouched behind trees, killed not by direct hits, but by the sheer overpressure and horizontal fragmentation of perfectly timed airbursts. The fast adjustment of American fire had created a new kind of no man's land. In World War I, this was a static space between trenches. In 1944, the Americans had made the entire tactical zone a no man's land. German after-action reports captured by Allied intelligence painted a picture of utter helplessness. One captured Oberst colonel of the 12th SS Panzer Division remarked during interrogation that the American artillery was not a weapon, but a form of environmental disaster. He noted that his men could handle the American tanks and the American infantry, but the invisible hand that could drop a shell on a moving motorcycle or a single machine gun nest within 2 minutes of its discovery was something they could not counter. Statistically, the impact was staggering. While the German 88 remains the most famous gun of the war, post-war analysis by the U.S. Army's Office of the Chief of Military History concluded that artillery was responsible for nearly 70% of all German casualties on the Western Front. The speed of the Fire Direction Center meant that the Germans could never achieve local superiority. Every time a German commander identified a weak point in the American line and committed his reserves, the steel rain arrived before those reserves could even reach the point of contact. The American artillery had effectively decoupled the German army's ability to coordinate its own movements. By late January 1945, the German High Command was forced to issue new directives on artillery-safe movement. They instructed units to move only at night or in the foulest weather, not to avoid American planes, which was a previous priority, but to avoid the eyes of the American forward observers. The German infantry's fear of the fast adjustment had fundamentally changed their doctrine from aggressive maneuver to terrified survival. The hunters had become the hunted, chased by a mathematical formula they couldn't outrun. The broader consequence of this tactical speed was a complete erosion of the German Kampfgruppe system. Traditionally, the German army relied on forming small, ad hoc battle groups of tanks and infantry to deliver sharp, localized counterattacks. These groups were designed to be nimble, hitting the Allies where they were weakest. However, the American Fire Direction Center, FDC, turned this nimbleness into a liability. Because the American gunners could shift their focus across miles of front in a matter of minutes, the German Kampfgruppen were often detected and annihilated before they could even cross their own start lines. This led to a strategic paralysis. By the spring of 1945, as the Allies pushed toward the Rhine, the German leadership began to lose faith in their own tactical maneuvers. They found that any concentration of troops, no matter how well hidden, was susceptible to a time-on-target mission the moment a single American radio operator caught a glimpse of a gray uniform. The psychological toll resulted in shell-shy units that refused to congregate in numbers larger than a squad, making it impossible for the Wehrmacht to launch any meaningful offensive operations. Furthermore, the American success in artillery adjustment revolutionized the post-war world. The concept developed at Fort Sill, the FDC, the centralized control of fire, and the use of forward observers as the primary tactical decision-makers, became the gold standard for NATO. The steel rain wasn't just a wartime phenomenon. It was the birth of modern combined arms warfare. The Americans had proven that in the industrial age, the side that could process information and calculate ballistics the fastest would ultimately own the battlefield. For the German infantry who survived the war, the memory of that speed remained the most terrifying aspect of their experience, a feeling of being targeted by a machine that was always one step ahead. When we look back at the titanic struggles of the Second World War, the mind often drifts toward the visceral. The clashing of heavy armor, the roar of the Mustang's engine, or the grit of the infantryman's foxhole. But the true architect of the Allied victory in the West was often a man sitting in a quiet tent miles behind the line, clutching a slide rule and a map. The American ability to adjust fire with blistering speed was not just a tactical advantage. It was the ultimate expression of a new kind of warfare, one where the stopwatch was as lethal as the bayonet. The German infantry, masters of the blitzkrieg, had entered the war believing that speed was a matter of engines and willpower. They were corrected by the cold, hard logic of the Fire Direction Center. They learned that in a modern industrial conflict, the most dangerous distance on Earth is the gap between seeing an enemy and reacting to him. The Americans closed that gap until it was almost non-existent, turning the chaotic landscape of war into a controlled mathematical grid. Today, the fields of the Ardennes and the ridges of Elsenborn are silent, the craters filled by decades of falling leaves and rolling mist. Yet, the legacy of the steel rain lives on. It is found in every modern GPS-guided munition and every digital targeting system used by today's sophisticated militaries. We live in an era where information dominance is the primary goal of any army, but that concept was born in the frozen mud of 1944, fueled by the frantic calculations of men who knew that a few seconds could mean the difference between a broken line and a historic victory. The German infantry never expected the Americans to just fire so fast, because they didn't realize they weren't just fighting an army. They were fighting a calculator with 1,000 barrels. And in the end, the math of the steel rain was a problem the Third Reich simply could not solve.